The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Peacham, Vermont, like a shroud that October day in 1989. Harold and Martha Whitmore had been fixtures in this small town for over 4 decades, their dairy farm a testament to the kind of quiet perseverance that defined rural New England. At 72 and 68 respectively, they still rose before dawn to tend their Holstein cattle, their weathered hands moving with the practiced efficiency of a lifetime spent working the land. The farmhouse, a white-clappered structure built in 1847, sat like a sentinel among the sugar maples that were just beginning to turn their brilliant autumn colors. The Whitmores had raised 3 children within its walls, weathered countless Vermont winters, and built a life that seemed as permanent as the granite foundations beneath their feet. But on the morning of October 15, 1989, something would shatter the tranquil rhythm of their existence forever. Before we continue with this story, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. It helps us bring you more stories like this one from across America. The first sign that something was wrong came when their youngest son, David, arrived for their usual Sunday dinner. David, 34 and recently divorced, had been making the 40-minute drive from his apartment in St. Johnsbury every week since his mother had expressed concern about his father's increasingly forgetful episodes. Harold had been diagnosed with early-stage dementia 6 months earlier, though he still insisted on maintaining his daily routines with stubborn determination. David pulled his rusted Chevy pickup into the circular gravel driveway at precisely 2 o'clock, just as he had done every Sunday for the past year. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard, where Martha's prize-winning dahlias still bloomed in defiant splendor against the approaching frost. But something felt different. The usual sounds were absent. No lowing of cattle from the barn, no cheerful call of greeting from his mother, no sight of his father puttering around the equipment shed with his German shepherd buck trailing behind. The silence was profound and unsettling. David sat in his truck for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled, listening to the whisper of wind through the nearly bare branches of the old oak tree that had shaded the farmhouse for over a century. He could see that his parents' 1985 Ford station wagon was parked in its usual spot near the kitchen door, and smoke was rising from the chimney, suggesting someone was home. Yet the absence of any human activity sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the crisp October air. Walking up the familiar stone path, David noticed that the morning newspaper still lay folded on the front porch, and yesterday's mail protruded from the wooden mailbox his father had crafted 30 years ago. These small details began to accumulate in his mind like pieces of an ominous puzzle. His parents were creatures of habit. Harold always retrieved the mail by noon, and Martha never let the newspaper sit unread for more than an hour after delivery. David knocked on the kitchen door, calling out in the cheerful tone he always used when arriving for Sunday dinner. "Mom? Dad? It's me?" The sound of his voice seemed to be absorbed by the heavy silence that surrounded the farmhouse. He tried the door handle and found it unlocked, another oddity, as his mother had become increasingly security-conscious since a rash of burglaries had struck neighboring farms the previous spring. Stepping into the kitchen, David was immediately struck by the scene that greeted him. The breakfast dishes sat on the table, partially eaten bowls of oatmeal growing cold, coffee cups half full, with a thin film forming on the surface. His mother's reading glasses lay folded beside her place setting, and his father's medication box sat open, the Sunday morning compartment empty, indicating that Harold had taken his pills as usual. The normalcy of the scene was somehow more disturbing than any sign of struggle would have been. It was as if his parents had simply vanished mid-meal, disappearing into thin air while engaged in the most mundane of daily activities. David called out again, his voice echoing through the rooms that had once been filled with the laughter and arguments of family life. He moved through the house methodically, checking each room with growing anxiety. In the living room, the television was still on. Tuned to the morning news program his parents watched religiously. Harold's favorite recliner showed the impression of recent occupation, and Martha's knitting lay in a neat basket beside her chair, needles still holding the partially completed scarf she'd been making for David's upcoming birthday. Upstairs, their bed was made with Martha's characteristic precision, hospital corners tucked tight, the handmade quilt her grandmother had stitched, smoothed without a wrinkle. Harold's clothes from the previous day were folded neatly on the cedar chest at the foot of the bed, and Martha's nightgown hung on its hook behind the bedroom door. Everything suggested they had risen that morning, dressed and gone downstairs for breakfast, just as they had done thousands of times before. David found himself standing in the hallway between his parents' bedroom and the room that had once been his own, listening intently for any sound that might indicate their presence. The old farmhouse creaked and settled around him, producing the familiar symphony of aging wood and shifting foundations that had been the soundtrack of his childhood. But there were no footsteps, no voices, no sound of human habitation. Racing back downstairs, David burst through the kitchen door and ran toward the barn, calling his parents' names with increasing desperation. The red barn, with its weathered siding and distinctive white trim, stood silent in the afternoon light. Inside, the 40 head of Holstein dairy cattle that were the heart of the farm's operation stood in their stalls, clearly distressed and needing to be milked. Some had been without milking for what appeared to be at least 12 hours, and their plaintive lowing filled the cavernous space. Buck, his father's loyal German shepherd, appeared from behind the barn, tail wagging tentatively, as if unsure whether David's arrival was cause for celebration or concern. The dog seemed agitated, alternately running toward the woods that bordered the eastern edge of the property and returning to David's side, whimpering softly in what seemed like an attempt to communicate something urgent. David quickly milked the cattle, his hands moving automatically through the familiar motions he had learned as a boy, while his mind raced with possibilities. His parents would never have left the animals unattended voluntarily. Their dedication to the welfare of their livestock was absolute, born of a lifetime spent understanding that the animals' well-being was directly tied to the family's survival. The fact that they had not performed the evening milking suggested that whatever had happened had occurred sometime the previous afternoon or evening. As the sun began to set behind the western hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that his mother had always loved, David made the decision to call the Caledonia County Sheriff's Department. He had hoped against hope that his parents might return with some reasonable explanation. Perhaps Harold had suffered a confused episode, and Martha had driven him to the hospital, though she would have called. Perhaps they had received word of a family emergency and left in haste, though David knew he would have been contacted immediately. Sheriff Tom Morrison arrived within 30 minutes of David's call, his patrol car kicking up gravel as it pulled into the farmyard. Morrison, a 20-year veteran of rural law enforcement, had known the Whitmore family since he was a boy, when Harold had hired him to help with hay season during his high school summers. The sheriff's weathered face reflected the gravity of the situation as David recounted the events of the afternoon. Together, they conducted a more thorough search of the property. Morrison's trained eye noted details that David had missed in his emotional state. The fact that Martha's purse sat on the kitchen counter with her wallet and car keys inside, Harold's jacket hung on its usual peg by the door, and most significantly, there were no signs of forced entry or struggle anywhere in the house. The absence of violence was somehow more troubling than its presence would have been, suggesting that whatever had happened had either been voluntary or had occurred without the Whitmores having time to resist. As darkness fell over the farm, Morrison called for additional units and contacted the Vermont State Police. Within hours, The quiet farmyard was transformed into a bustling command center, with officers, detectives, and volunteers arriving to begin what would become one of the most extensive missing persons investigations in Vermont history. The search began at first light the next morning, with teams of volunteers from the community joining law enforcement personnel to comb every inch of the Whitmore property and the surrounding countryside. The farmhouse sat on 200 acres of rolling pasture, woodland and cropland, bordered by state forest on two sides and neighboring farms to the north and south. The terrain was challenging, with rocky outcroppings, deep ravines carved by spring snowmelt, and dense stands of maple, birch and pine that could easily conceal evidence or, God forbid, bodies. Margaret Henderson, Martha's closest friend and neighbor, arrived early that first morning with thermoses of coffee and homemade sandwiches for the searchers. Margaret, a woman of 71 with steel-grey hair and eyes that had seen 7 decades of New England seasons, had lived on the adjacent farm her entire life. She and Martha had shared morning coffee at least 3 times a week for over 40 years, their friendship weathering the storms of child-rearing, the challenges of farm life, and the gradual loss of contemporaries to age and illness. Martha would never leave those animals, Margaret told Detective Sarah Collins, the lead investigator assigned to the case. Not for any reason. I've seen her milk cows with a broken wrist, tend sick calves when she had pneumonia herself. Those cattle were like her children, especially after the kids grew up and moved away. Detective Collins, a 15-year veteran of the state police with a reputation for tenacity and attention to detail, found herself confronting a case that defied easy explanation. In her experience, missing persons cases involving elderly individuals usually fell into predictable categories. Medical emergencies leading to wandering and disorientation, family disputes that prompted someone to leave temporarily, or in the worst cases, domestic violence that escalated to tragic conclusions. But the Whitmore case possessed none of the usual markers. The investigation quickly established that Harold and Martha's marriage, while not without its challenges, had been stable and loving. Friends and family described them as devoted to each other, with Harold's recent diagnosis actually bringing them closer together as they faced the uncertain future of his declining mental faculties. Their 3 children, David, Patricia in Boston and Michael in Seattle, all confirmed that there had been no family conflicts, no financial pressures severe enough to cause desperation, and no indication that their parents were planning any kind of departure. Financial records revealed a modest but stable situation. The farm had been mortgage-free for over 20 years. Their savings account contained enough to cover several months of expenses, and their Social Security payments were direct deposited without interruption. Harold's medical expenses for his dementia treatment were manageable, covered largely by Medicare and the supplemental insurance he had maintained through his decades of membership in the Vermont Farm Bureau. The physical evidence was equally puzzling. Crime scene technicians found no fingerprints in the house beyond those of the family members, no signs of forced entry, no indication of violence or struggle. The breakfast dishes on the table showed no evidence of having been interrupted by anything more dramatic than their occupants simply standing up and walking away. Harold's medication schedule suggested he had taken his morning pills as usual, and the television guide showed that he had marked his intention to watch a farming program that afternoon. One detail that particularly struck Detective Collins was the presence of a grocery list in Martha's distinctive handwriting on the refrigerator, itemizing purchases needed for the following week. The list included ingredients for a pot roast dinner she had promised to prepare for David's birthday the upcoming Sunday, suggesting that she had been planning for the immediate future with no indication of any intention to disappear. As the first week of searching progressed with no discoveries, the investigation expanded beyond the immediate area. State police contacted hospitals throughout Vermont and neighboring New Hampshire to inquire about any elderly patients who might have been admitted without identification. They reached out to bus stations, airports, and train terminals, though the absence of the Whitmores' car made it unlikely they had used public transportation. The community response was overwhelming, reflecting the deep roots the Whitmore family had established in Peacham over 4 decades of residence. Neighboring farmers took turns caring for the cattle, ensuring that the animals Harold and Martha had devoted their lives to would not suffer during their absence. The local church organized meal trains for David, who had taken leave from his job at a lumber mill to coordinate the search efforts and manage the farm operations. Patricia arrived from Boston 3 days after her parents' disappearance, her face drawn with exhaustion and worry as she embraced her brother in the farmhouse kitchen where they had shared countless family meals. Michael flew in from Seattle 2 days later, the 3 siblings reuniting under circumstances none of them could have imagined. Together, they went through their parents' belongings with methodical care, searching for any clue that might explain the inexplicable. The task was emotionally grueling, requiring them to examine the intimate details of their parents' lives while fighting against the growing certainty that something terrible had happened. They found Harold's journal, which he had kept sporadically for over 30 years, documenting the daily routines of farm life, weather patterns, cattle births and deaths, and the gradual changes in the community around them. The final entry, dated 3 days before the disappearance, was typically mundane. Milked at 5:30, Martha making apple butter. Need to fix fence in south pasture before snow. Martha's correspondence revealed a woman deeply connected to her community and family, someone who maintained regular contact with relatives scattered across New England and friends from her church and various community organizations. Her last letter, mailed 4 days before she vanished, was to her sister in New Hampshire, discussing plans for Thanksgiving dinner and expressing mild concern about Harold's increasing forgetfulness, but nothing that suggested any crisis or intention to leave. The siblings also discovered that their parents had been quietly but consistently generous in their support of various local charities and individuals facing hardship. Anonymous donations to families whose farms were struggling, contributions to the church's fund for heating assistance for elderly residents, and regular financial support for a scholarship fund at the local high school painted a picture of people deeply invested in their community's well-being. As October gave way to November, the daily searches began to wind down, though Detective Collins continued to pursue every possible lead. The case had attracted regional media attention, with television news crews from Burlington and Boston covering the story of the vanished Vermont farm couple. The publicity generated dozens of tips, each of which required careful investigation, but none yielded any concrete evidence about what had happened to Harold and Martha. The arrival of winter brought new challenges to the investigation. The first significant snowfall in mid-November covered the landscape with a blanket of white that would persist until spring, potentially burying evidence that might have provided answers. The harsh Vermont winter also made outdoor searches increasingly difficult and dangerous, forcing investigators to scale back their efforts just as the trail was growing coldest. David found himself alone on the farm more often as the investigation wound down and his siblings returned to their lives in distant cities. The isolation was profound, surrounded by the memories of his parents' presence but lacking any explanation for their absence. The house seemed to echo with phantom sounds, his mother's humming as she prepared meals, his father's heavy tread on the stairs, conversations that existed only in memory. The cattle had been sold to a neighboring farm as David lacked the expertise and emotional capacity to maintain a dairy operation while dealing with his grief and uncertainty. The empty barn stood as a monument to his parents' life's work, its silence more deafening than the lowing of the cattle had ever been loud. Buck, his father's faithful companion, remained on the farm, but the dog seemed diminished by the absence of the man he had followed for 12 years. Christmas of 1989 was a subdued affair, with the three siblings gathering in the farmhouse more out of a sense of obligation than celebration. They had hoped that somehow their parents might return by the holiday, that whatever force had taken them might relent and restore the family's wholeness. Instead, they found themselves going through the motions of tradition while confronting the growing likelihood that Harold and Martha were never coming home. As 1989 gave way to 1990, the active investigation transitioned into the cold case files of the Vermont State Police. Detective Collins, despite her best efforts and the investment of hundreds of hours, had been unable to develop any credible theory about what had happened to the Whitmores. The case remained officially open, and she continued to review the file periodically, hoping that new information or advances in investigative techniques might eventually provide answers. The impact on the Whitmore children was profound and lasting. Patricia struggled with anxiety and depression, finding it impossible to fully engage with her life in Boston while the fate of her parents remained unknown. Michael threw himself into his work with obsessive intensity, using the demands of his career in the tech industry to avoid confronting his grief. David, who had been closest to his parents geographically and emotionally, found himself unable to leave the farm, as if maintaining their physical space might somehow draw them back. Years passed with agonizing slowness, each birthday and anniversary serving as a reminder of the unsolved mystery that had shattered their family. The farmhouse began to show signs of David's bachelor occupancy, a man who had never learned the domestic skills his mother had possessed, living alone in a space designed for family life. Dust accumulated on Martha's knitting supplies. Harold's workshop grew cold and unused, and the rhythms of family life gradually faded into memory. The community of Peacham, while never forgetting the Whitmores, slowly adapted to their absence. New families moved into the area. Children who had never known Harold and Martha grew up hearing their story as local legend. The farm itself became something of a landmark, known throughout the region as the place where the elderly couple had mysteriously vanished, spoken of in hushed tones at town meetings and coffee shops. Detective Collins retired from the state police in 1995, but she never forgot the Whitmore case. In her final months on the job, she had transferred all the case files to her successor, Detective Ray Martinez, with explicit instructions to review them annually and to immediately investigate any new information that might emerge. The case had become something of an obsession for her, a professional failure that haunted her long after she had left law enforcement. Meanwhile, the Whitmore children struggled to rebuild their lives around the absence of resolution. Patricia eventually moved back to Vermont in 1993, unable to bear the distance from the place where her parents had last been seen. She took a job teaching at the local elementary school, finding some measure of peace in working with children and contributing to the community her parents had loved. Michael remained in Seattle but visited Vermont regularly, each trip a pilgrimage that brought both comfort and renewed pain. David continued to live alone on the farm, maintaining the property, but never fully inhabiting the life his parents had built there. He worked various jobs in town, at the hardware store, helping with road maintenance, doing odd jobs for neighbors, but never committed fully to any single occupation. His life seemed suspended, waiting for a resolution that might never come. The passage of time brought changes to the investigation technology and techniques available to law enforcement. DNA analysis, which had been in its infancy in 1989, became a standard tool for investigating cold cases. Computer databases allowed for more sophisticated cross-referencing of missing persons cases across state lines. But despite these advances, the Whitmore case remained as mysterious as ever, lacking the physical evidence that might have benefited from new scientific methods. In 1995, Detective Martinez conducted a comprehensive review of the case file, re-interviewing witnesses and family members, hoping that the passage of time might have loosened memories or encouraged someone to come forward with information they had previously withheld. The review yielded nothing new, but it served to remind the community that the case remained active and unsolved. The late 1990s brought a new element to the mystery when construction work on a housing development 15 miles from the Whitmore farm uncovered skeletal remains that were initially thought might belong to the missing couple. The discovery generated intense media attention and renewed hope among the family members that they might finally have answers. However, forensic analysis quickly determined that the remains belonged to a much younger individual and were likely decades older than the Whitmore disappearance. As the 10th anniversary of the disappearance approached in 1999, the local newspaper ran a lengthy retrospective piece about the case, interviewing family members and law enforcement officials about the enduring mystery. The article renewed public interest in the case and generated several new tips, though none proved fruitful. It did, however, serve to remind readers that the Whitmore family was still seeking answers, and that any information, no matter how seemingly insignificant, might be valuable. The approaching millennium brought with it a sense of temporal significance, as if the turning of such a major chronological corner might somehow provide the resolution that a decade of investigation had failed to produce. David found himself thinking more frequently about time and its passage, about the moments that had led up to that October morning in 1989, and the years that had elapsed since without explanation. It was during this period of reflection, in the early months of 2000, that David decided to undertake a project that he had been avoiding for over a decade, the thorough cleaning and organization of his parents' personal belongings. For 10 years, he had lived in the farmhouse surrounded by their possessions, maintaining everything exactly as they had left it, as if preserving the physical evidence of their lives might somehow preserve their lives themselves. The decision to finally go through their belongings was both practical and emotional. David had begun to consider selling the farm and moving somewhere he might be able to build a life independent of the shadow of his parents' disappearance. But before he could take such a step, he needed to sort through decades of accumulated possessions, deciding what to keep, what to donate, and what to simply discard. He began with the most emotionally neutral spaces, the basement storage area, the attic, the outbuildings where his parents had kept seasonal decorations, old furniture, and the accumulated detritus of rural life. Working through these spaces was like archaeology, uncovering layers of family history preserved in boxes and trunks that hadn't been opened in years. In the basement, David found boxes of his own childhood artwork and school papers, carefully preserved by his mother with the sentimentality that had characterized her approach to family life. There were photo albums documenting family vacations, birthday parties, and the gradual transformation of 3 children into adults. Each image was a time capsule, capturing moments of ordinary happiness that seemed impossibly precious in retrospect. The attic yielded even more treasures and mysteries. His grandmother's wedding dress, preserved in tissue paper, boxes of letters his parents had exchanged during their courtship, and Harold's army uniform from his service in Korea, still wrapped in plastic from the dry cleaner. Each discovery was a piece of the complex puzzle of his parents' lives, revealing aspects of their history and personalities that David had never fully appreciated. But it was in his father's workshop, tucked away in a corner of the barn that David had rarely entered, that he made the discovery that would finally provide the answers the family had been seeking for 11 years. Harold's workshop was a testament to the practical skills that had served him throughout his life as a farmer. Shelves lined with hand tools, mason jars filled with screws and nails sorted by size, and workbenches scarred by decades of repairs and projects. David was sorting through a collection of old coffee cans filled with various hardware when he noticed something unusual about one of the cans on the highest shelf. Unlike the others, which were clearly visible and easily accessible, this particular can was pushed far back against the wall, partially concealed behind a stack of agricultural magazines. When David pulled it down and pried off the plastic lid, he found not screws or bolts, but a folded envelope with his name written on it in his father's distinctive handwriting. The envelope was sealed, and David's hands trembled as he opened it, somehow sensing that whatever it contained would fundamentally change his understanding of what had happened to his parents. Inside, he found a letter dated October 14th, 1989, the day before his parents had vanished. "My dear son," the letter began in Harold's careful script, "if you are reading this, it means that Martha and I have made the decision we hoped we would never have to make, and the time has come for us to leave this life behind." David sank onto his father's workbench, the letter shaking in his hands as he continued reading. The words that followed would finally explain the mystery that had haunted his family for over a decade, but the truth was more heartbreaking than any scenario he had imagined. Harold's letter continued with a confession that was both shocking and heartbreaking in its simplicity. His dementia, he wrote, was progressing much more rapidly than he had let anyone know. The diagnosis they had shared with the family was accurate, but the reality of his condition was far worse than they had revealed. Harold had been experiencing episodes of confusion and disorientation that were becoming increasingly frequent and severe, and he had begun to have moments where he didn't recognize Martha or remember basic aspects of their life together. "The doctor told us privately that I likely have only months, perhaps weeks, before I won't be able to recognize the people I love most," Harold had written. "I cannot bear the thought of Martha watching me disappear piece by piece, of becoming a burden to our children, of losing myself so completely that I become a stranger living in my own body." The letter revealed that Harold and Martha had made a mutual decision to end their lives together rather than face the prolonged agony of his mental deterioration. They had chosen to do so in a way that would spare their children the trauma of discovering their bodies or dealing with the stigma and guilt that often accompanies suicide in small, close-knit communities. "We have decided to walk into the woods behind our farm, to the place where Martha and I used to go when we were courting, where we carved our initials in an old maple tree 50 years ago," the letter continued. "We will be together there, as we have been together through everything else in our lives. We have taken measures to ensure that we will not suffer, and that when the time comes, we will simply fall asleep in each other's arms." Harold explained that they had deliberately staged their disappearance to look mysterious, hoping that without bodies or obvious evidence of suicide, their children might be spared some of the pain and social complications that would accompany a clear case of self-inflicted death. They had hoped that eventually their remains would be found in the woods, appearing to be the result of an accident or natural death, allowing their children to grieve without the additional burden of guilt and questions that suicide often brings to surviving family members. "I know this will cause you pain, and for that I am deeply sorry," Harold's letter concluded. "But please understand that this decision comes from love, not despair. Martha and I have had 54 wonderful years together. We have raised 3 beautiful children who have become good and successful adults, and we have lived to see our grandchildren. We are not running from life. We are choosing to leave it while we still have the capacity to make that choice together. with dignity and love. The letter ended with specific instructions about where David might find their remains, in a secluded grove approximately 2 miles into the woods behind the farm, near a distinctive rock formation that Harold described in detail. He also included information about financial matters, insurance policies, and various personal items they wanted distributed among their children and grandchildren. David sat in the workshop for nearly an hour, reading and rereading his father's words, trying to process the magnitude of what he had discovered. The mystery that had consumed his family for 11 years was finally solved, but the solution brought its own complex mixture of grief, relief, and understanding. His parents had not been victims of foul play or tragic accident. They had been authors of their own fate, making a decision born from love and the desire to maintain their dignity in the face of an inevitable and devastating decline. The next step was to verify what the letter claimed and to finally bring his parents home. David called Detective Martinez, who was still handling the cold case, and explained what he had found. Martinez arrived at the farm within 2 hours, accompanied by a crime scene technician and a representative from the medical examiner's office. Together, they examined the letter and prepared to search the area Harold had described. The search party set out into the woods on a clear morning in early March 2000, following Harold's detailed directions through terrain that had been thoroughly searched 11 years earlier but had yielded no evidence at the time. The area Harold had described was remote and difficult to access, requiring a hike through dense forest and over rocky ground that would have challenged even experienced searchers. After nearly 4 hours of hiking, they found the grove Harold had described, a small clearing surrounded by ancient maple trees, one of which still bore the faint scars of initials carved decades earlier. Near the base of that same tree, partially concealed by 11 years of fallen leaves and forest growth, they discovered what remained of Harold and Martha Whitmore. The remains were found exactly as Harold had predicted, lying close together in what appeared to be a final embrace. Time and the elements had reduced them to bones and fragments of clothing, but their positioning suggested that they had died peacefully, without struggle or distress. Beside them, investigators found an empty bottle that had once contained a powerful sedative and a second letter, this one written in Martha's handwriting. Martha's letter was shorter, but no less poignant than her husband's. She wrote of her love for Harold and her unwillingness to live without him, especially knowing that his mind would soon be lost to the disease that was stealing him away piece by piece. She expressed her love for their children and grandchildren, but explained that watching Harold disappear while his body remained alive would have been unbearable for all of them. "We are not giving up," she wrote. "We are choosing our moment, our place, our way of saying goodbye. We will be buried together in the cemetery where we always planned to rest, and our love will continue even after our bodies return to the earth that has sustained us throughout our lives." The discovery brought closure to one of Vermont's most enduring missing persons cases, but it also opened new wounds for the Whitmore family. David, Patricia, and Michael were forced to confront not only the reality of their parents' death, but also the fact that Harold and Martha had chosen that death rather than trust their children to support them through Harold's decline. The family's response was complex and deeply personal. There was relief in finally knowing what had happened, gratitude that their parents had not suffered at the hands of another person, and a profound sadness at understanding the desperation that had led to such a final decision. There was also anger at their parents for not trusting them with the truth, at themselves for not recognizing the depth of Harold's condition, and at the circumstances that had forced such impossible choices. The community's reaction was equally complicated. Some residents expressed understanding and even admiration for Harold and Martha's decision to face death on their own terms. Others felt betrayed by the deception and the resources that had been expended on a search for people who had chosen to disappear. The local church struggled with the theological implications of suicide, while neighbors who had participated in the searches wrestled with their own complex emotions about the revelation. Detective Martinez, who had inherited the case from Detective Collins, found himself experiencing a mixture of professional satisfaction at finally closing a long-standing case and personal sadness at the circumstances of its resolution. The investigation had been thorough and competent, but it had been impossible to solve because the missing persons had deliberately made themselves impossible to find, at least until they chose to reveal the truth through Harold's carefully placed letter. The remains of Harold and Martha Whitmore were buried together in Peacham Cemetery on a bright spring day in 2000, more than 10 years after their disappearance. The funeral service was attended by hundreds of community members, reflecting the deep impact the couple had made during their decades of residence in the area. The pastor spoke of love, sacrifice, and the mysterious ways in which people face life's most difficult challenges. David, Patricia, and Michael each spoke at the service, sharing memories of their parents and trying to make sense of the choices Harold and Martha had made. David spoke of his father's pride in the farm and his mother's devotion to family, emphasizing that even in their final decision, their parents had acted out of love rather than despair. Patricia talked about the lessons her parents had taught about facing adversity with dignity, even when that dignity required difficult choices. Michael reflected on the complexity of love and the ways in which it can manifest even in actions that seem contradictory to survival. The farmhouse remained in the family, with David ultimately deciding to stay rather than sell. The mystery that had kept him tethered to the place had been resolved, but he found that his roots there ran deeper than just the search for his parents. The farm represented not just the scene of their disappearance, but the foundation of everything they had built together as a family. In the months following the burial, David began to restore the farm to active operation, not as a dairy, but as a diversified agricultural enterprise that reflected both tradition and adaptation to changing times. He planted fields of vegetables for local markets, raised sheep for wool and meat, and gradually transformed the property into something that honored his parents' legacy while creating space for his own future. The Whitmore case became something of a touchstone in discussions about end-of-life choices, family communication, and the complexity of love in the face of terminal illness. Medical professionals in the region used it as a case study in the importance of honest communication about prognosis and the need for comprehensive support systems for families dealing with dementia and other degenerative conditions. The letter Harold had left became a subject of legal and ethical debate. Some argued that his careful planning and the delay in discovery had constituted a form of fraud, wasting public resources and causing unnecessary anguish to family and community members. Others maintained that his actions, while tragic, represented a deeply personal choice about how to face death, and that the pain caused to others, while real, had been unintentional. For the Whitmore children, the years following the discovery brought a gradual process of understanding and acceptance. Therapy, both individual and family, helped them work through their complex emotions about their parents' choice and their own responses to it. They came to understand that Harold and Martha's decision, while painful for those left behind, had been made from a place of love and a desire to maintain control over their own destiny in the face of an inevitable and devastating decline. The story of the Whitmores became part of the local folklore of Peacham, told and retold with variations and interpretations that reflected the storyteller's own understanding of love, loss, and the choices people make when facing impossible circumstances. Some versions emphasize the romance of a couple choosing to die together rather than be separated by illness. Others focused on the tragedy of lives cut short and the pain inflicted on family members left behind. As time passed, the immediate intensity of the emotions surrounding the case began to fade, replaced by a more nuanced understanding of the complex factors that had led to Harold and Martha's decision. The community began to see their choice not as a simple case of giving up, but as a complex decision made by people who had faced an impossible situation with courage, if not wisdom. The farmhouse, once a crime scene and then a monument to mystery, gradually returned to being simply a home. David married in 2003, and he and his wife began to fill the rooms once again with the sounds of daily life. The birth of their first child in 2005 brought new life to a place that had been shadowed by loss, suggesting that even the most profound tragedies could eventually give way to renewal and hope. The woods, where Harold and Martha had chosen to end their lives, became a place of pilgrimage for David and his siblings, not morbid fascination but genuine connection to their parents' memory. They would visit the grove on significant anniversaries, bringing flowers and spending quiet time in the place where their parents had made their final decision together. The case of the vanished Vermont farm couple became a reminder of the complexity of human love and the ways in which people respond to life's most challenging circumstances. It illustrated the profound bonds that can exist between partners who have shared decades of life together, and the lengths to which people will go to protect their dignity and autonomy even in the face of death. Harold's letter, carefully preserved in the case files of the Vermont State Police, stands as a testament to the power of love to transcend even death, and to the courage required to face impossible choices with grace and determination. The mystery that had puzzled investigators for 11 years was solved not by forensic science or detective work, but by the deliberate revelation of truth at a moment chosen by the people who had created the mystery in the first place. Today, more than 2 decades after Harold and Martha Whitmore walked into the woods behind their farm for the last time, their story continues to resonate with people who struggle. The story resonated far beyond Vermont, highlighting not just the heartbreak of loss, but the deep complexity of aging, autonomy, and family love. David's discovery brought not only answers, but new questions. What would life have been had his parents chosen a different path? What lessons lay in the silent fears they carried between themselves? In the months after his discovery, David reached out to others in town, speaking openly about Harold's dementia and the pain Martha had felt watching her partner slip away. The community, at first stirred by confusion and conflicting emotions, began to rally around the Whitmore children. Local churches hosted evenings devoted to supporting families facing memory diseases, sharing resources, advice, and, importantly, the value of candid conversation in times of crisis. These gatherings, inspired directly by the Whitmore legacy, helped peers talk about fears that had, until then, stayed hidden out of shame or discomfort. Even local legislators referenced the Whitmore case in later debates about elder care policy. David wrote a letter published in the local Peacham Gazette, expressing both gratitude for the community's support during all those years and sorrow for the pain their secret must have caused. He shared excerpts from Harold's final words, emphasizing that their choice had never been about abandonment, but about controlling their final days when control elsewhere was slipping away. These words moved many, sparking a broader regional discussion of dignity at the end of life and rural families' struggles to access mental health resources. Meanwhile, Patricia coordinated with state historical groups to record the Whitmore story as oral history, collecting interviews with townsfolk, family members, and investigators. She worked with museum curators in St. Johnsbury to preserve photographs and artifacts from the farm, her mother's quilting patterns, her father's journals and cap, for future generations. The artifacts not only anchored the Whitmores' personal narrative, but also served as touchstones for countless other stories of ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges. Michael accepted an invitation to speak at a health conference in Burlington, sharing his perspective as someone who loved from afar and struggled with guilt over absence. He donated some of his speaking fee to a new scholarship fund in his parents' name, designated for local students pursuing careers in nursing, especially those interested in geriatrics and rural medicine. Every spring, the siblings gathered at the woods where their parents had chosen their ending. The forest floor was rich in new growth now, trillium, ferns, and the beginnings of maple leaves. They brought their own children and spouses, each ceremony informal but solemn. David would stand by the carved initials on the old maple and read aloud a passage from their father's final letter. Patricia, quietly, would lay a quilted square on the ground. Michael would add a small stone, engraved with the year. As the sun filtered through the branches, scattering light on the ground where Harold and Martha lay, the Whitmore family found a kind of peace. The farm revived. David and his wife, Sarah, grew the business beyond traditional crops, collaborating with nearby schools to teach agricultural science. They converted part of the barn into a community classroom, where kids could learn practical skills alongside stories of families like theirs, those who built, struggled, and endured. The Whitmore legacy became not just one of disappearance and pain, but of honesty, healing, and new beginnings. As each season turned, the lessons of loss deepened the capacity for empathy in Peacham, and the mystery became, at last, a memory transformed by understanding. Through interviews, letters, and annual gatherings, what began in tragedy became a multi-generational testament to the importance of facing uncertainty together. Even now, strangers who visited the cemetery often left notes of thanks at the Whitmore gravesite, messages about their own families, their fears, their hopes for peace with impossible decisions. The secrecy that once shrouded the Whitmores' fate gave way to quiet wisdom, carried forward in the traditions and conversations of a small Vermont community, forever changed by 2 lives and 1 letter, lost and found.